Today we're talking about two of Paul's pastoral letters, which are 1st and 2nd Timothy. So once again, the author is Paul, and for both of these letters, he is writing them to Timothy. So sometimes people get this confused that these letters were written by Timothy, but that's not the case. They were written by Paul to Timothy. And when Paul wrote these letters to Timothy, it was probably understood that Timothy would share these with his congregation in the church. So the more narrow audience was just Timothy himself, but then he would have read these letters to the congregation. The date is most likely 63 AD, which would have been probably after Paul's first release from prison. And one thing about these two letters is Paul's authorship has been debated among scholars. This letter is very different from many of Paul's other letters in terms of just the vocabulary that Paul uses and even his theology. And it's not totally different. It's not. There's not enough evidence to overthrow the idea that Paul is the author, but there's just enough differences to cause doubt. So that's kind of an ongoing discussion among scholars as to whether Paul truly is the author. But as I said, at this point, there's not enough evidence to come to the conclusion that Paul is not the author. So who was Timothy? We know just kind of right off the bat that Paul and Timothy had a very close relationship. But just looking at background information on him, Timothy was from the area of Galatia. He had a Greek father and a Jewish mother. And it seems that Paul was the one to lead Timothy to Christ sometime on Paul's first missionary journey. And then pretty much from that time on, they shared a very close relationship. Timothy went with Paul on his second missionary journey and then was there for part of the third missionary journey. And Paul actually labels Timothy as his dear son in the faith, his closest disciple. But then just maybe an additional characteristic about him that we find Paul writing in his second letter to Timothy, maybe he was a little bit timid. In this passage, Paul encourages him, and the context seems to be that this is a continual reminder that Paul gives Timothy to be brave or to step up with courage. So that tells us a little bit about Timothy and the closeness that he shared with Paul. So we see that Paul pretty clearly states his reason for writing this first letter in chapter 3, verses 14 and 15. And it seems that Paul had planned on coming to visit Timothy, but in the meantime, he's sending this letter filled with instructions on how Timothy can manage the church and encourage the people within the church to conduct themselves as they should. So just a few reasons for writing. Kind of the overall theme as far as the pastorals is that Paul is writing to give principles for how to care for the church and how to be a good leader within the church. But then you also have the issue of false teachings that were spreading throughout Ephesus, and so Timothy had the responsibility of fighting against these false teachings and showing the truth of the gospel. And then finally, there's the more personal note that Paul wants to encourage Timothy, his close disciple, and continue to instruct him and mentor him. So then the key themes are about false teachers, those that were trying to negate parts of the gospel, and then how to worship, how to, conduct pure worship within the church. And then also a big theme on church leadership qualifications. So what kind of person is a good candidate to be a leader in the church? What are characteristics of those that would be good church leaders? So then it's a pretty simple outline. Chapter 1, Paul is addressing Timothy more personally. And then chapters 2 and 3, he is more addressing how ministry should be conducted to lead to a healthy, flourishing church. And then the last few chapters are expectations for ministers. So back to how should the people act that are going to be leaders within the church, and what are the expectations for how they should live? So then a few interesting facts about this first letter. Paul's list of qualifications for church leaders, there's a list here and in Titus that are still very prevalent. They're used in the church today, often when selecting deacons or elders or people that are going to lead in the church. Churches often turn to this list and kind of use it as an example. And then second, 1 Timothy 2:11 through 15 is a key text when it comes to the discussion of women's roles in the church. So this is a text that I think is just fascinating. It's one that as with anything, there's so much research to be done, and so the debate is basically about what is the specific context that Paul is writing in? Is he writing from a stance that what he says should stand for all time, should be a teaching for all time, all areas, or should it be the specific context of this first century church in Ephesus? And so as we read this passage today, I think to be a faithful, to do a faithful exegesis of the text, we have to take the context. We have to keep the context in mind and not just be looking at through the lens of today when we're reading this, but go back and look at the lens of kind of this first century church and the first century culture. And then I think we can get to a more faithful interpretation of this text. So then transitioning to Paul's second letter to Timothy, once again, he's writing to Timothy, and this one was a few years later, and it was not long before Paul was executed. So this was actually Paul's last letter that we have that he wrote before his death. And so, of course, the tone is much more emotional and heartfelt as Paul is writing to his closest disciple, and it seems knows that his death is quickly approaching and he will not be here for much longer. So then his reason for writing is to continue to instruct Timothy in light of the false teachings that continue to creep into the church. He also wants to exhort Timothy to carry on the ministry that Paul started. So he's calling Timothy to just continue to be faithful even after Paul is gone. And then finally, Paul requests for Timothy to come and visit him in prison. So you can imagine how this would be a very much more emotional letter compared to some of the others. So then the outline, it's a pretty short letter. Chapter 1 is very much about guarding the treasure of the gospel. So keeping close, ensuring that false teachings do not tamper with the gospel, with the way that people are perceiving the gospel, and just a call to faithfully teach what the gospel is. And then second, enduring hard things for the gospel and not giving up and sharing the gospel with others. And then finally, chapter 4, just continuing the thoughts of preaching the gospel and then personal instructions from Paul to Timothy. So that kind of wraps up a little bit about these two letters. I think they're really interesting, and I think these will prepare you for to dig in, to read these letters.